Ladies and gentlemen, today is January the 12th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo, yo.
How are you?
Apocalyptic, how are you?
Yeah, I saw the pictures you sent me.
Yeah. Got those just
Such
from where we live.
not far, huh?
Mm-hmm. We were 3 streets away from the evacuation zone.
Wow.
So really on that knife edge there. But it was a very exciting thing. I haven't really been close to a fire where you felt the impending danger of it. Normally forest fires happen far away, and like when I lived in Seattle, some days it gets really smoky, so you have to close your windows and turn on an air purifier. But this was a whole different animal. Just wind ripping the fire in all different directions, and it was slowly crawling toward us up on the Runyon Canyon, and we're looking at it, and I'm trying to be positive of like, yeah, maybe it'll go to the other side of the mountain, and it just goes directly toward us. And it's like, well, I don't think it would go through the really heavy concrete streets and buildings and stuff like that, which it ended up getting squelched by a bunch of water helicopters where they fly around it, circle around, and then dump a whole bunch of water onto it. So the fire closest to us was contained and it's completely extinguished, but there are some really big active fires. The Palisades fire is still completely out of control. I think the Eaton fire is still going. So it's really weird to have been living here for a while, and we've gone around kind of renting a car and driving to Malibu and driving to different places. And a lot of the places that we've driven through are completely destroyed. Like there's no homes left. The cars that were in the street are just a frame and ash at this point. And yeah, it's pretty insane.
Yeah, it sounds pretty destructive from what I've seen.
I wonder how many billions in damage it's going to total up to be.
Well, those are some of the more well-off suburbs, aren't they?
Yes. A lot of the
Yeah.
places that got cooked are, I would say, maybe millions of dollars for their homes. Just because the location is so nice and fancy. You have access to LA, but you're far enough out of the way that it's not super busy. And they have lots of plants and stuff, so it's very chic, and you're living in nature, and there's lots of different kinds of wildlife and all that sort of stuff. But if you're in certain areas, it's just completely gone now. So we'll see what happens.
Well, they should be able to rebuild, yes?
Yeah, it's one of those things where the fire clears the stuff, so it's basically new real estate. I'm not sure how it would work for, I guess you still have the property rights, and I don't know what your home insurance is going to be like, but it'll take a while to rebuild all of that stuff.
Well, if anybody could do it, I would imagine it would be one of the wealthiest cities on the planet.
Yeah, California already has state taxes and stuff, so it's been interesting that people are sharing a lot of weird opinions about this and theories about who could have caused this, if it was maybe an arsonist or a few who got it started. But the winds that we had were sometimes up to 90 miles an hour. So if embers are being flicked around at 90 miles an hour, it's really hard to contain that, even if it just started as a natural fire. The winds that occurred were pretty unusual. I think that's pretty clearly a cause of human-caused climate change in some sense. It reminded me a little bit of the climate event we had in Seattle where there was a heat bubble, and it was 105 degrees for like 2 weeks, which never happens up there. This was a similar sort of deal, it felt like, where we have fairly still weather. Sometimes you have a light breeze, and it was just super windy. So the wind plus the dryness and those factors together meant that if there was any little spark or a cigarette or something, then that can just really roar out of control. But yeah, I don't know what they can do to prepare for future, like maybe reconsidering what materials you're building homes out of, or some kind of contingency plan for if there is a fire going through. Like, are there any breakpoints where it would just die out and not be able to transfer over? But fuck if I know.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the subject myself. Well, I mean, are you safe? Like, how is it looking right now?
I'm safe. The Palisades fire is the one that's closest that could potentially move in this direction, but there's just so much dense metal and concrete city that I don't really think it has the fuel to get over to us. It is moving toward Beverly Hills, so it could hit UCLA next. That's kind of a place that's in danger, and then Beverly Hills. So, yeah,
Hmm.
the Museum of Tolerance could also get hit. Jeez.
Yeah, fire doesn't give a fuck.
Nope. Indiscriminate violence. There was a Getty Villa. We were going to go to a museum and check it out. That place got cooked.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just a museum that had a bunch of kind of European style architecture and sculptures. It looked like something you would see in Italy.
Hmm.
And I think that place got pretty cooked. Santa Monica, that has a bunch of really bougie houses on the beachfront. Those all got completely cooked. I would like to like run around and try to get some photos, but a lot of the areas of the greatest devastation have been like walled off, and there are people preventing you from going that way.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense.
We've
If it's
had
been burned
water
down.
and power the full time too, which is good. So
Oh, yeah. Well, sounds like they're kind of holding the line.
they're trying their best to. It seems like it shouldn't be that hard to stop, but with wind, it really is.
Yeah. Yeah, embers will do that. They get around. And fire can travel very, very fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was some video footage from the Australian wildfires from a while back where it just blows through an area before you even know it.
Mm-hmm.
Just hits you and then it's gone. Boom.
Yep. One of my favorite bands is from Australia, and they made a song about one of the recent wildfires and the people who died and the devastation and so on.
Hmm.
I believe there were firefighters for this LA fire from Canada who came out to help, and then Idaho also sent some.
Yeah, there's generally volunteers when it gets really bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they've got prison inmates contributing, out of state firefighters, probably federal assistance, some international assistance. And when it comes to natural disasters, we're pretty well organized.
Mm-hmm. National Guard came out too, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me.
There have also been a lot of looters who are trying to capitalize on it. Because
Of
if you've
course.
got rich people houses and they're all evacuated, and it's like, well, maybe they got some expensive shit over there.
Yeah,
So the police have been pretty active too.
par for the course.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever had a chance to see firsthand the firefighting aircraft that they've been using?
The helicopters we've seen, and we did see some of the planes too. I didn't see the planes doing stuff to it. I'm not sure if they also. I think they dropped that like red goop onto things, but we didn't see planes. We saw a bunch of helicopters mainly, and then some drones.
Drones, were they?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if they were helping with the fire or just like getting video just so they can track where it's going.
Oh, surveillance. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Yeah, it's actually pretty hard to pilot aircraft in that kind of environment. All of the heat from the fire kind of messes with the wind.
Yeah. Air pressure probably feels pretty different.
Mm.
People have had lots of political opinions. I know Los Angeles is a progressive bastion in the country, so some people who dislike that whole thing have seen it as like a haha, they're getting their just desserts, but it's really wide-ranging calamity that affects people of all kinds over here. It's a very diverse community, so it's a very big stereotype to put everyone into one political box here.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people aren't even that politically
Suburbs
engaged.
would be relatively more conservative, wouldn't they?
Yeah, maybe. It's tough to say.
Well, people never miss an opportunity to be partisan, especially in the United States.
Yep. It's one of the longest running sports games. Left versus right.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think much will come of it. Yeah, from my reading, it just seems like a natural disaster. I haven't really seen much reason to read much more into it than that.
Mm-hmm.
Have you heard different?
There was someone in Twitch chat, this isn't claiming that it wasn't a natural disaster, but they were claiming that there was an environmental group that was fighting really hard to stop the pre-burns that they kind of prescribed to prevent this kind of raging wildfire, where they burn selected areas so that if there is a fire, it ends up running out of fuel at some point. So some people are blaming that group and whatever efforts they made to kind of stop the pre-burning to control stuff.
Yeah.
Lots of conspiracy theories about if this was politically motivated in some sense. They're quoting Trump for saying that he didn't want to give California like money for wildfires or whatever, and then they had this, so some people are wanting to make a causal inference there, but I haven't seen anything like super clearly pointing to anything. It could very much just be a climate event that went out of control that we're not really prepared for. It was a lot more destructive for property than it was for people. I think it's maybe 8 people who have been killed, which is very low considering the amount of devastation. It's still not a good thing, obviously.
How many pyros have they caught so far?
I know that they caught at least one dude with a blowtorch who was running out. But a pyromaniac is like not a super rare hobby. My brother actually has been doing firefighting work in South Dakota, and they had a repeat offender arsonist who I think he started like 8 different fires before they caught him. But he's just the kind of person who wants to watch the world burn because it's fun and it gives him a feeling of power, so.
Yep. That's how they think.
Yep.
They come out of the woodwork when the big fires like this start up.
Mm-hmm.
They want to participate, I guess.
Yeah. This is my moment. There are some really funny videos of, well, like funny / scary, of people trying to defend their home with their own water hose. There's one guy who was like defending it for 2 or 3 days, and all the houses around him got burned to the ground because they all evacuated and stuff, and he's just trying his best to like water it away and keep things intact. And it looked like he survived it, so that's pretty epic, but definitely a very high risk, and he did get some degree of lucky that the wind could whip a certain way and still get his house, but ended up being fine.
Yeah, if the fire really comes your way, then you're not going to stop it with a fire hose.
Mm-hmm. I guess garden hose is what it was.
Yeah, a garden hose. That's not going to be enough for like a full like wall of flame wildfire that's being pushed by the wind at 30, 60 miles an hour.
Yeah.
That'll just engulf you before you can even do anything with your garden hose.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think you're right. He probably was just very lucky.
Yeah, and as everyone knows, Wall of Fire is a 4th level spell slot. Very intense. Does a lot of damage. Requires concentration.
Well, violent fires aside, how have you been the past few weeks?
I'm doing okay. It's been kind of catching up with family at the end of the year into New Year's and stuff, and then getting back into the swing of things after having a subathon. I tried out Path of Exile 2 today for the first time.
What did you think?
It seems good. The environments look really good. The gameplay is fun. Casting animations are cool. It's complicated, but it wasn't really overwhelming because as you level up, yeah, the talent tree is really large and there's a lot of choices, but for every level up, you only really have about 4 choices, at least starting out. So it's not really that intimidating to play. I made a sorcerer class for my first character. I think I got up to level 6, but it seems really good. I don't think it would hook me as much as like Baldur's Gate, just because of I like the characters and the conversation options and the aesthetic of BG3 a lot, whereas this game you're just a solo character in a kind of a dark, dingy environment. It looks more like Diablo 4 than like BG3, at least so far in the early game, but very good game. I can see why people are really hyped about it.
Did you ever play the first one?
Yes, I played that last month just to see what the hubbub was about. The first one I played the Ranger class, and it was pretty fun to aim the bow shots and so on.
How do you think they compare?
They looked strikingly similar to me. The second one obviously has a pretty big graphical update, and it seems like it's a bit simpler, but almost exactly the same. Like the inventory looks the same. The character abilities and talent tree being really complex is pretty similar. You would have to ask someone who's played both of the games a lot to really know what the key differences are. But from what I've heard, they say that the barrier to entry is a little bit easier, but it's still just as complex at the highest level if you're trying to play the game to the full.
Well, what I had read was that the second one has less loot, that you don't level up as fast, and that the bosses are much more challenging. Whereas the first Path of Exile, it's more of a power fantasy. You know, you can level up much more quickly. You get a lot more loot to work with, so you feel more powerful through most of the game, and you can blow through it relatively quickly.
I could see that. I just played for about 2 hours in each of them, so didn't really get to the mid game or the end game.
Yeah, we got some good Diablo clones these days. We're truly blessed.
Yep.
We didn't have any for a long time. So we should all be grateful that Path of Exile exists to fill that niche.
Yeah, if you don't like the turn-based of BG3, I would think that you would like it a lot. I like the turn-based stuff. My solo honor mode run, I'm in the Underdark now. After wiping at Joachim's Rest with the fire department quest. So dumb. I was there to help. And they only took like 5 fire damage, and they're like, okay, that's it. We're all hostile to you.
Yeah, that's one of those little bottlenecks in the game, I guess. We've got to be careful of that.
And so this time when I went into Joachim's Rest, I sent 1 character to handle it. The rest of you are going to stay out as a contingency plan. I'm running a Battlemaster Fighter as my Tav, Shadowheart is a Sword Bard, Gale is an Abjuration Wizard, and Karlach is a Throw Zerker. That's my current loadout.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
How are you enjoying the Throw Zerker?
It's very fun. I really like the returning pike for the early game because it's about the same damage as the other items, so you can very lazily just throw that and it goes back to you almost every time.
Yeah.
It just does so much damage because you get basically a full attack hit with your action and your bonus action every turn, and then just having really heavy damage resistance to all physical types is also really strong. Just doesn't have that many downsides.
It's pretty robust.
I'm excited for the new subclasses. The Path of the Giant Barbarian seems really cool too.
I think that's still a couple months away, right? Well, was there any particular drama in the world you wanted to get to? Anything that caught your attention the past few weeks?
Not really. I've been pretty occupied with local drama, so I haven't really been able to stay tuned with world news. I think we have a presidential inauguration fairly soon.
Oh yeah, what is it, like a week or two away?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it starts soon.
Yeah.
It's going to start again soon, Neuro.
A very fancy, fun circus we know and love.
I was ready to move on when it ended the last time, but I guess the rest of the country is not. So we'll see how it goes.
I went around to.
Well, there's not really a whole lot that happened the past few weeks. I had a couple notes, but it's nothing too big.
Yeah, we just had that one crazy week.
Yeah, that's a standout easily. There was some drama in the news about the gas deal between Russia and Ukraine finally ending. So some people were talking about how it was like a major watermark. Watermark. That's not the word I wanted. It was a big deal for Europe. They were trying to make it sound like, this was the end of Russian gas exports to Europe, and it was pretty significantly overblown. For those of you maybe not familiar with this, even though Ukraine and Russia have been at war for the past some years, Russia actually had still been exporting natural gas through Ukraine to Europe. And the reason both parties were okay with that is because both of them made money off of it that they could use to kill each other. It was an odd situation, but it was mutually beneficial, so they both continued that arrangement. However, the Ukrainian government did announce that they were not going to seek to renew the agreement. And so now that it has expired, natural gas is no longer flowing through Ukraine to Europe. And so that's going to make it harder for Russia to export natural gas to Europe, and it's going to mean the end of transit fees, basically, for Ukraine for said Russian natural gas that had been moving through their territory. So, as I mentioned, the media kind of blew it up and, tried to make it into a big deal. But the reality is that Russia can use pipelines that run through Turkey and the Balkans to export natural gas into Europe. So this shouldn't really be too big a change overall. So that was some fake drama, basically. It was in the news cycle for a while, and then it just went away. There were some planes that were shot down. I guess I shouldn't say shot down. One of them was shot down, the other one crashed. There was a big plane crash in South Korea. They're still trying to kind of figure out what happened with that. There was another one shot down. Well, it was hit in Chechnya, and I think it went down in the Caspian Sea. It was originally from Azerbaijan, and it was on its way to Kazakhstan. And basically all of the evidence is that the Russians shot it down, presumably by accident. There's been a lot of Ukrainian ranged fires of one kind or another, cruise missiles and whatnot that have been hitting targets in the Russian interior. And probably what happened is that air defenses in Chechnya mistakenly identified the civilian airliner as some kind of cruise missile or something, and then shot it down. And at first, Moscow tried to deny responsibility, but that's par for the course for them. It's not unusual. The Azerbaijani government wasn't really having it, though, and basically released statements that the Russians had, in talks with them, indicated that they may actually have been responsible, and then it just kind of went from there. So everybody is assuming at this point it was Moscow, and that it was most likely an accident of some kind. Nothing much is going to come of that. It's not going to damage relations, really. Shit happens, especially during a war, so probably all parties involved will just move on.
So you said what kind of aircraft? A passenger aircraft?
Yeah, it was a civilian airliner.
Oh, damn.
Let's see. Did we talk about the terrorist attack in Germany?
I don't think so.
Yeah, there was one in Magdeburg. There was a guy driving a car who turned into some kind of festival in the downtown area, and then just drove through a whole shit ton of people.
Damn.
Yeah, he was, it seems, well, no, wait, this is the weird guy. Yeah, this was the guy everybody assumed was an Islamist, and it turned out that he was an atheist.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, it was a very weird case study.
What's his motivation then?
We don't really entirely know. He was originally from the Middle East. He had been Muslim, but then he abandoned the faith, became an atheist, migrated to Germany, and apparently he was an AfD supporter. So everything about this guy is very weird. Like it doesn't really add up.
What's AfD?
Normally, the Alternative for Deutschland. It's sort of
that's the right wing.
Yeah, the right-wing populist party in Germany. They're the ones that complain about immigrant Muslims committing terrorist attacks. So it's weird that we have a guy who's a former Muslim atheist who supports the AfD who commits a terrorist attack. The calculus doesn't really add up there. So make of that what you will. I don't think anybody's made any sense of that yet, last I checked. Nope. There was a bunch of drama with Elon Musk. Did you catch any of that?
No. What do you do this time?
Well, there was a kerfuffle amongst sort of the tech bro part of the Trump coalition and the populist part. Musk and some of the other tech guys are very pro H-1B visa. And then a bunch of it, obviously, other people, the populists in the coalition are very much against that. And so there was basically an argument that broke out on social media between critics of Musk and supporters of Musk. So the media had fun with that for a while. That made the rounds on social media. Oh, there was also the budget thing. So the United States has a problem. At this point, you really have to call it a chronic problem, getting an annual budget passed. What they've been doing for the past year has been basically agreeing to these short-term funding agreements in lieu of a normal annual bill that would just set the budget for the whole year. And that's not unusual. That often happens. That's been often happening for the past 10, 20 years, whenever there's a lot of resistance from some populist conservatives who want to significantly cut funding or otherwise just turn the budget into an opportunity to grandstand about this, that, or the other thing. So this past year has been no exception. So what had happened is that there was a deal made for another temporary extension, basically another temporary funding deal, and then Elon Musk came out and said that he opposed it, and that I don't remember specifically, it's been a few weeks now, but basically he opposed it. And so then some conservative politicians who had been supporting it withdrew their support, and then the temporary deal ended up failing. And so that led to a big kerfuffle online about, Musk is actually de facto president, and, he's basically running the government, this unelected billionaire, exerting power over public policy. It was very overwrought, basically. It eventually all just kind of sorted itself out, no surprise. I think Musk himself ended up kind of walking back his opposition. But it does illustrate just how little trust there is in American politics right now. That's probably going to continue to color political interactions in Washington for the foreseeable future. Did we talk about the... go ahead.
I was going to say a lot of people are wary of his influence and stuff, and how they see him as someone who, even if he isn't in a position to have the presidency, he has the ear of the president, and he also definitely has invested in his own influence expanding with things like buying Twitter, which is a big money sink, but it gives him access to a lot of people's just activity feeds and stuff. A lot of people use that platform, so even if it's a minus for dollars, it's a plus for his influence over other people.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the criticism of Musk is kind of exaggerated. I don't think he has nearly as much power as some of his critics say that he does within the Trump coalition. That'll probably become more and more apparent over time. But for now, a lot of people are very mistrustful, and they're just going to continue to kind of read into his actions, basically, this degree of billionaire power that they think he has. And it's going to make political compromise difficult, basically. Lots of partisanship heading our way for the next few years, so that's going to become very normal, I expect.
Yeah, there's a lot more weight for the conservatives this time around in terms of Supreme Justices, and I think their influence over the legislature is stronger than it was last time Trump had a term. So maybe they'll be able to get more stuff done.
Probably not. I certainly, with control of the House and Senate, they'll be able to kind of get their way, most likely. I don't know that control of the Supreme Court is as meaningful. We'll see how that shakes out. It just kind of depends on how much they can get passed and how ambitious they want to be. But I haven't seen a whole lot of ambition thus far. They talk a big game. That is to say, the incoming Trump team talks a big game about all the stuff they want to do. But, if the first term he was in office is in any indication, he's probably not going to even get around to doing like the vast majority of that stuff. We'll see. But I would note that while there are relatively more Trumpista conservatives in the Senate and House this go around, the conservative majority in the House is also narrower. I think coming out of the November election, they only had like 5 or 6 seats in majority in the House. And that's going to get cut down because I think something like 3 or 4 members of the House are going to end up joining the Trump administration. And to do that, they're going to resign their seats. So once they're gone and until they're replaced, the Republican majority in the House is going to be like 3 or 4 dudes, which is extremely narrow. And that's going to make it relatively easy for even the relatively small number of centrists in the Republican Party to sabotage anything too extreme that House leadership may want to do. And that was not so much the case the first go around. In Trump's first term, the Republicans had a larger majority in the House. But in that case, his disadvantage is that fewer of them were like hardcore Trump supporters. So it's possible they could be very ambitious and try for the moon here, but given how narrow the majority in the House is, that fact may end up clipping their wings a bit.
Yeah, also I'm just thinking that the time it takes to author a bill and kind of put it through and stuff is a limiting factor, where you can talk about all the different things you want to do under the sun, but even if you do have a majority, it's going to be difficult to get everything passed.
Yeah, time is the major factor restricting your freedom of action as a politician in Washington. So, especially when you consider like all of the days that congressmen get off, the actual window of time that they have to really pass legislation and to negotiate it and whatnot, that's relatively small. So there's only so much that they can realistically do, one way or the other. So I think probably, well, one of the things I've read is that they're going to try to get around the 2/3 rule in the Senate by using reconciliation, which is a way of getting around that. So they're talking about using that to try to very quickly do a bunch of stuff that's on the incoming Trump administration's agenda. But they may or may not have the votes to do that. We shall see. I think one of the things I remember reading they wanted to do was some kind of abortion restriction. Don't remember. I think it was a new rule that would require that abortion providers give equal treatment, equivalent to what they would give to a live birth, to children who end up surviving botched abortion attempts, which is very, very rare. But apparently they want some kind of national legislation on that.
Yeah, well, if there's anything I've noticed is that sometimes getting a piece of legislation through, even symbolically, is a good way to get your base really happy and excited. Even if it doesn't really have that many practical applications.
Yeah, a couple of other items that they had. I guess this is two things that they've already done. This is in my notes here. They changed the rule on how easy, that defines how easy it is to change the House leadership. Because before, if you wanted to hold a vote on whether or not to elect a new Speaker of the House, you only needed one to hold that vote. Of course, you still had to get a majority once the vote was held in order to actually, change the leader. But just getting the vote on the docket only took one guy, which basically guarantees in periods of high partisanship that your Speaker of the House is going to be in constant danger and has much less leverage than he would otherwise. They've actually changed that so that voting to hold the vote in the first place requires at least 9 people instead of just one. So that improves the Speaker of the House's leverage somewhat so that he's marginally less vulnerable to challenges from the fringes of his own party or the opposition.
Mm.
Let's see. Oh, one of the things they want to do, they want to limit bills considered under suspension of the rules. So normally that requires a 2/3 majority to pass. It will continue if they make this change. But they will only be able to do it on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays. Currently they can kind of just do it whenever. The idea there is that they want to try to force politicians to be more efficient. At least that's what I think it was about. The idea is that normally, the reason that this is kind of something they want to do is that normally negotiations for bills drag out, and they frequently, when I say they, I mean congressmen will frequently try to wrap up those negotiations at the end of the week, and they'll try to get whatever compromise they agree to passed using suspension of the rules, by suspending the rules, so that they can pass their compromise faster and whatever little time is left at the end of a given week. And so they're trying to take that away. You can still do it, but you're going to do it earlier in the week, generally in the phase of negotiations when you're nowhere near a compromise. So the idea is to try to force people to try to come to a compromise quicker, and also to become less reliant on this rule, to try to jam in, try to pass bills at the end of the week very quickly without a lot of public notice or review. So that's a very technical change. I don't think that's necessarily going to be a game changer. I mean, even if you can't get a compromise done by the end of the week, you can just finish it the next week, basically, assuming you're not doing it like just before a big holiday anyway.
I think I remember you mentioning when that happened before.
Suspension of the rules?
Sneaking in legislation whenever things are less active, which I think is technically allowed.
Yeah, so long as you have a quorum, you can pass stuff. But this is a little bit different. Suspending the rules is what you do when you want to kind of just get stuff done quickly, and you already kind of have the votes for it. Again, you need 2/3 majority to do suspension of the rules. So that means that you can only really do it when you already have a compromise in place. So this isn't necessarily something that's sneaky, unless you're, a regular citizen who would prefer that you be a part of the process and have a chance to kind of review the stuff that they're trying to pass. Sneaking in legislation is more what you do when you have a big bill that has a lot of stuff in it, and you try to kind of squeeze in something minor. Maybe that has a significant effect, but you maybe put it in a place as part of an omnibus bill that people wouldn't expect it to be, added to. Those are frequently added as amendments. So there will be a big bill discussing some topic of import, and then sort of later in the process, maybe even at the tail end of the process, right before it passes, a couple amendments are added that basically act as additional laws that are tacked on to the one being voted on. So that is legal, but it doesn't really have to do with suspension of the rules.
Mm-hmm. I see. Respect for rules is such an interesting concept when it comes to institutions and the culture of a country, and how it can be seen as a good thing and a righteous thing to respect the rules, but then it can also be seen as a weak thing. That's like, why are you not taking the opportunities that are coming your way of being able to just capitalize on these amazing perks of corruption?
Yeah, it's that's institutions in a nutshell. You know, do you have institutions where people are kind of observing the rules in place and allowing the institution to function as intended, or are people just dominating it, you know, ignoring the rules for their own benefit and then subverting it to their own will? It's very difficult to build out observance of rules as a norm in a society, which is why people should be more mindful of maintaining that norm and not, you know, rewarding people for challenging it. Because if you lose it, we don't really know how to fix it.
Yeah.
That's not something that you can pay an engineer to go and like fix. It's something that emerges organically, you know, through history, through organic social development over time. And that's not something you can kind of synthesize. You know, once it's gone, it's kind of gone. Well, did we talk about the USS Gettysburg last time?
Doesn't sound familiar.
Yeah, so the USS Gettysburg, I think, is a cruiser, and it was in the Red Sea, where, of course, there's been some action going on for some months now between the U.S. Navy and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, if you want to call them rebels, whatever your preferred adjective would be. So, you know, the Houthis have been firing rockets, missiles, what have you, at Israel as well as at international shipping in the Red Sea. The U.S. Navy has been trying to hit their launch sites, among other targets of opportunity. And recently, just a few weeks ago, there was an FA-18, which is a naval aircraft that was flying in the Red Sea, and it was actually shot down by the USS Gettysburg. The pilot survived, you know, that wasn't a problem, but friendly fire is obviously not supposed to happen in that environment. And so there was a bunch of questions about, you know, how it happened and, you know, who was going to be held responsible for it. It's quite the fuck up. Shooting down your own aircraft is, you know, bad mojo in the best of circumstances. But it's been especially rare for the past couple years. The United States hasn't been actively at war in Afghanistan or Iraq or what have you since, well, in Afghanistan's case, 2021. So one would think the tempo of operations would be low enough that this wouldn't really be an issue, but obviously something went wrong somewhere. I think what I read is that they thought it was some kind of Houthi drone. The Houthis have been intermittently firing at U.S. Navy ships, and generally they shoot down the incoming munitions, but in this case, it seems an FA-18 was incorrectly identified as such a munition.
Yeah, that's considered pretty bad micro when you blow up your own units.
Yeah, I should say so. Let's see, did we talk about the European Union and the UK?
I don't think so.
Yeah, so the British government right now is being led by Labour, and they're struggling right now to try to figure out what to do with the British economy. The British economy has had ongoing problems for like 20 years now. Brexit partly happened because people wanted something, some catalyst to try to help fix that, help address that, but it didn't really work. And the new Labour government is going to take their crack at it. Probably they will fail too. The problems with the British economy are just structural in nature. It's not really something that a government can easily fix, regardless of their approach to doing so. But Labour wants to try, and so they've agreed to a summit with the European Union where they're going to discuss revisions to the Brexit agreement that was agreed to some years ago. I think it was finalized in early 2020 or so. So, Brexit is the gift that keeps on giving, as always. So we're going to see some negotiations about the negotiations that happened over Brexit. Probably nothing of substance will come out of it. From what I read of the negotiations and the respective positions of the parties involved, they're not really going to be high stakes negotiations. Some of the things the UK wants: free movement for musicians and entertainers. Obviously, leaving the European Union meant they lost the right, or any rights they had anyway, for free movement of people into the European Union single market. So the British government wants to get some access for very particular actors within Britain, again, specifically musicians and entertainers. Obviously, they were disproportionately impacted by the loss of free movement into the single market. Mutual recognition of professional credentials. That was another loss from leaving the European Union. It used to be that if you had some kind of professional credential, maybe like a doctor, a dentist, whatever, then you could very easily, as a British professional, move into the European Union and practice that profession. Not so much after the UK leaves the EU. So they're going to discuss that. Also, they're going to talk about a veterinary agreement. That sounds very niche, but one of the other major niches of the British economy that really lost out from Brexit was actually British agriculture, since being in the European Union meant that they had ready and easy access to the European single market. Since they've been out, normal customs procedures have been imposed by the European Union on imports of British goods, and that's had a pretty dire impact on British agricultural exports to the continent. So a veterinary agreement would presumably create uniform standards between the EU and the UK that would alleviate the need for normal customs procedures that delay and in some cases basically make export de facto impossible. I would point out that, even if you do allow Britain to export stuff, agricultural goods specifically, into the European Union, if it's delayed by too much by the customs procedures in place, then it's de facto impossible. Because agricultural goods are frequently perishable goods, especially if it's seafood. And if you can't very quickly get those to market, then you just can't sell them. And the way the customs procedures are for a lot of perishable goods coming from Britain, it just takes too long to get them to market for their export to be feasible. So that's a de facto block on exports. So the British government wants to try to standardize some of the rules and regulations about some of the primary sector goods that have been most impacted, to try to restore that trade and ease the impact of Brexit on that particular sector of the economy. So, like I said, this is pretty low stakes stuff. Agriculture, musicians and entertainers, professional credentials, these are pretty small parts of the overall British economy. It'd certainly be a big deal for the specific individuals that are kind of in those fields. But the overall British economy is very much a services economy that's focused on things like, tech, finance, what have you. To a much lesser degree, manufacturing, and none of that is going to be really impacted by this stuff for the most part. And that's assuming any of it actually ends up in a final revised agreement, which is not necessarily going to be the case. The European Union has as one of its principal objectives to ensure that Britain is not too comfortable outside of the European Union. They do want friendly relations, obviously, but if you have as much access to the European Union single market outside of the EU as you do inside of the EU, then why would you be in the EU? It doesn't really make sense. In order to maintain relevancy, the institution that is, again, the European Union, does need to ensure that there are some disparities, some disadvantages to being outside of the European Union, to ensure that the institution just does not become irrelevant to the point that it just dissolves. Let's see, I think the EU did have some objectives in the negotiations as well. One of them is the right to fish in British waters. Fishing was one of the big sticking points in the Brexit negotiations back in the day. The British government was very much hell-bent on trying to ensure minimum access to British waters for European continental fishermen. They wanted to try to reserve as much of Britain's fishing stock for British fishermen as possible. I would point out that fishermen are not like a major constituency in the United Kingdom, but it was kind of a symbolic issue that had been held up as important to British sovereignty. And of course, states are very jealous about guarding their sovereignty. So it turned into a sticking point. The European Union wants to revisit it. We'll see how it goes. Also, the European Union is interested in free movement for young people. So, again, in Britain's case, they're interested in free movement for musicians and entertainers. The European Union wants a broader category that encompasses just sort of young people in general. That's going to impact students in particular. Presumably, it would make it very easy for British or European students to study in each other's universities. But also, it makes tourism easier and just general travel. Presumably, that could encompass musicians and entertainers, but I assume that because the British government is focused narrowly on musicians and entertainers, they do not want like a wider freedom of movement to apply, since that would probably also result in a number of low-skill migrant workers coming into the UK. And that, of course, was one of the major catalysts for Brexit in the first place. People upset about immigration of that variety were major supporters of Brexit. So that's what they'll be talking about. I did read that the European Union thinks that the UK is going to try to tie defense issues into the talks, but they've basically stated that they'll just absolutely reject any attempt to include defense issues in these revised Brexit negotiations. They want to focus very narrowly on trade, and everything else is going to be a separate negotiation.
What would those even entail? Some defense issue?
To a degree, immigration, also Russia, the Ukraine conflict in Russia anyway, and possibly defense industrial base issues. One of the big sort of trends, shall we say, in defense policy in the Western world writ large is that there's been increasing momentum to try to standardize and homogenize all of the different defense industries in the West. Because historically, everybody in the West has had their own defense industry, their own national defense industry, and they kind of do things their own way. There's some standardization in NATO, but it's relatively minimal. And so everybody kind of doing the same thing a different way just creates needless duplication. And so there's been a push to try to standardize all of that and have everybody kind of cooperate a lot more at the defense industrial base level to try to create more efficiencies and cost savings. The catalyst for that has been the rise of China, which has an immense industrial base. Its defense technology is not quite up to Western standards still, but there is a sense that ensuring that the West has access to a defense industrial base comparable to China is in the national security interests of the collective West, so to speak. And so there has been momentum towards making that happen. But of course, it's difficult because nobody really wants to cede a national defense industrial base. That's considered a matter of sovereignty. It's a source of jobs and economic growth. People are very wary about giving up control of that as part of some kind of standardization agreement that would presumably encompass multiple nations. So there has been progress made over time, but it's very, very slow and very grudging. We'll see what comes of it. But presumably that's one of the defense type matters that the British government may have wanted to wrap in to the trade negotiations here, because Britain has relatively more leverage in terms of defense matters than it does in terms of trade. The European Union, in terms of just economic activity, is way, way bigger than the UK. The UK does not have leverage there to bully the European Union on much of anything. But on defense matters, the UK is much stronger than most European nations. And so that puts them in a stronger position there to maybe extract some concessions on trade-related issues in exchange for British support on certain defense-related issues. That would make a lot of sense from London's perspective. However, Brussels is aware of that fact, and that's exactly why they're refusing to include defense issues in the negotiations. They're basically saying, if we're going to talk about trade, we're only going to talk about trade, and by doing so, maximizing the European Union's leverage in those negotiations. And again, the European Union is just so much bigger that they can actually basically force the UK to do that.
So crazy to me that referendum, they had no idea. No idea how tangled up this would be and how many different issues they would have to work through.
Well, a lot of people did. It's just the voting public wasn't, basically. And a lot of people just didn't even think just assumed it would fail, including the Prime Minister at the time, Cameron. I think he said himself that he just kind of assumed that the referendum would fail and then he could just kind of move on to other priorities. For those who don't remember, the Brexit referendum was a promise that Cameron made when he was running for office in the election before the Brexit referendum was held. And that promise to hold the referendum was basically just a throwaway promise that he made to try to get critics on the right to support him. Because, of course, the Tories in Britain have their own factional politics, and one of the big factions in the Tories had always been the European Union membership skeptics, guys who thought the UK should not have joined the European Union and that it was de facto violating the UK's sovereignty as an independent state. So they were very critical of Cameron. They thought he was too centrist, too middle of the road. And so to get them on side, he promised them a referendum on British membership in the EU, on the assumption that surely most people would vote against it because he came out and said that he himself thought the UK should stay in the EU. Whoops.
Big whoops. Yeah, it's a reminder to ask that really wise question of, what if things don't go as I think they will go? Quite the meme, that Brexit.
Very much so.
We did have a question. Someone's asking, is the level of conflict in Sudan to the level of a genocide, or is that being overblown? I see that word being thrown around frequently over the last several years.
Yeah, people have gotten pretty lax about how they use the word genocide. They like to throw it around a lot, unfortunately. Is the level of violence in Sudan tantamount to genocide? Kind of. The war in general is not genocidal in nature, but the wars in Darfur province of Sudan could credibly be considered a genocide. I don't think it's as bad as it used to be. I'm sure some of the older listeners maybe remember all of the drama about Darfur 20 years ago, way back in the early Bush administration. There was a lot of news attention that was being paid to genocide in Darfur in Sudan. Back then, the militia conducting the genocide was called the Janjaweed. They're still around. They were never, dispersed or defeated. Rather, they were incorporated into the government and basically turned into the president's Praetorian Guard. The president at the time was not on good terms with the military. They were basically competing poles of power within the Sudanese government. And so the Janjaweed were brought on board on the president's side to help defend him against the military. And that Praetorian Guard evolved into the Rapid Support Forces, as they are called now, one of the two major factions fighting against each other in the current civil war. So unsurprisingly, the base of support for the Rapid Support Forces is the same as the Janjaweed that they evolved from, which was Darfur. And so as the civil war has unfolded in Sudan over the past few years, significant violence has been inflicted upon the non-Arab population of Darfur by the Janjaweed / Rapid Support Forces. So you could consider that genocidal, since the violence in Darfur is still ethnic in nature. But I don't know that it's as bad as it was 20 years ago. And if it's not as bad as it was 20 years ago, then it might not really breach the threshold for genocide. Also, it may not necessarily be the case that the current violence is intended to be genocidal. It may just be that they're attacking the army or perceived supporters of the army. And because that just happens to overlap with ethnic identity in the province, it looks very similar to genocide, but without establishing motive, it's kind of hard to judge. Where do you draw the line between normal civil war and genocidal civil war?
Yeah, and that seems like asking the question, is the violence about the faction or is it about the type of person?
Yeah. And to a degree, those two are not mutually exclusive. It could be that they think that they're doing both. It could be that the rapid support forces are initiating the violence as part of the civil war to try to mitigate the control of the army over Darfur by going after people that they assume are going to support the army over the rapid support forces. And if that also gives them a convenient excuse to go after and eliminate their ethnic rivals in the province, all the better. So killing two birds with one stone, basically, may be the rapid support forces' objective here, in which case it is both genocidal and not genocidal in nature. Did we have any other questions?
Not that I'd seen yet.
Oh, did we talk about Justin Trudeau?
Not today.
Did you know that he announced that he's going to resign?
No.
Yeah. He says that he's going to stick around as prime minister, but only until his party can pick somebody new. So it seems like his term in power has come to its end. I think he's been around almost 15 years. Pretty long time. He's actually around when Trump was still in office.
Interesting. I know his approval has been pretty down lately.
Yeah, people are very skeptical about housing in particular, I think is one of the main agitants. There's also skepticism about immigration. I think a lot of people, from what I've read, a lot of people in Canada seem to be, at least in part, attributing immigration as a major determinant of high housing prices in Canada. Which is relevant, but also is probably not the main driver of that. At least in the United States, probably the more important driver is going to be local land use regulations, zoning laws and that kind of stuff. Not the kind of thing that impacts it in the short term, but over time, the effect accumulates if you have overly restrictive zoning laws, and we're very much in the latter stages of that at this point. I'm not familiar enough with zoning laws in Canada to know if it works similar. But regardless, immigration has been identified as something that people want less of in Canada, broadly speaking. So there's an immense amount of skepticism about Trudeau, partly for his failure to deal with immigration and housing, but also just people are kind of tired of him. He's been around too long. Not enough has really changed for the better. In fact, a lot of things seem to be changing for the worse, and people are looking for something different. Last time I checked, the polls suggested that the Conservatives were the favorite to win the upcoming elections. I think they've still got a while to go before the elections are held, but it seems as though Conservatives are in pole position to take back power in Canada for the first time since the Harper administration. Do you remember Harper at all?
No, not really.
It's a long time ago. He was sort of like a mini-me Bush in some ways. Back during the War on Terror, Harper was kind of always there to support the Bush administration. Not to the point of getting involved in Iraq, He was pretty reluctant to do that, but did jump into Afghanistan, and the Harper administration was notably more hawkish than previous administrations in Canada had been. I think they wanted to change the national animal at one point. Wanted to change it from what was it, the beaver? Mm-hmm. Is that what it was? Change it from the beaver to like a bear or something. Mm-hmm. Some weird esoteric bullshit. It was some kind of culture war type thing. Harper did a lot of that back in the day. I remember reading about it. It's been a long time, though.
How could we stand up for ourselves as a country when our national animal is a beaver? It's like, well, you can dam up the river and see what that does.
Yeah, he also wanted to build up the Canadian Navy's presence in the Arctic. That was another big thing that he wanted to prioritize. I don't think anything ever really came of it, though, but I do remember him pushing for it a lot for a long time. Yeah, eventually he ended up the head of a minority government, and that very much limited his freedom of action. I think at that point, he kind of fell out of the news cycle a little bit. And I think after that is when Trudeau came in, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think the current candidate that the Conservatives are pushing as their preferred replacement as Prime Minister is really similar to Harper, though. Harper was very much an old school conservative, sort of an establishment guy, basically, in the grand scheme of things. The new guy is kind of more populist. Not as much as, sort of the Trump movement in the United States, but that style of politics, I think, from what I've read, is more in his wheelhouse. I trust we have people in chat who will know more about it than I do. I haven't been following Canada super closely. I don't think whether Canada votes out Trudeau or does not vote him out is really going to matter too much. Kind of similar to Britain, I think the problems in Canada's economy are structural in nature and therefore are going to be more or less immune to significant government action. It would probably take something radical to really significantly change those overarching economic trends. And I don't see that as being in the cards, certainly not with the main establishment parties.
We got a question on the UK. Can you ask him what he thinks about the UK government refusing to call an inquiry into the grooming gangs?
I mean, what I think, I don't really care too much. I don't do culture war stuff. It feels very toxic to me. It's like the political equivalent of MOBAs. The community that gets the most invested in them is frequently toxic. And a lot of the issues that culture warriors focus on are generally not that substantive. Yeah, there has been a problem with gangs in the past, and also I think currently, if I'm not mistaken, in the UK, but I don't know that they're more likely to groom people than previous iterations of gangs have been.
What does it mean, groom people in this context? Like brush their hair or something else?
So this issue kind of goes back like 10 years or so, and it has to do with immigrants for the most part. There had been a number of allegations about immigrants grooming young girls, basically.
That kind.
Yeah, that kind of grooming, and getting them involved sexually with the gang, basically turning them into sex slaves, trafficking them, getting them involved in prostitution, that kind of thing. And the allegations were kind of denied, especially by the media, and then it kind of came out a few years later that actually there was substance to them, to the point that even the government itself kind of admitted that there was a problem. So that's kind of been a running issue for a long time. I thought it had kind of been settled, so I was surprised when it cropped up again. People have been accusing the British government of covering it up, and there's been some back and forth in the media about that. But I don't think the issue is really any substantively different than it had been before, when it had been prominent maybe 5-10 years ago. So I don't know why people are wanting to revisit it now. I know there hasn't been a lot of action taken. It's still happening, but I don't know that the problem is just so much more severe than it's ever been. I mean, gangs always do that. That's not abnormal. Like any kind of significant gang of any kind has female members that probably were groomed, probably are disadvantaged teens that were taken advantage of. That's a sadly very common story. So again, I'm not super invested in that. I could easily be wrong. Maybe it is more of an issue than it normally would be with a gang. But regardless, haven't been following it closely. I don't think, even if it did turn into a big issue, that there's a whole lot you would be able to do about it. Because again, gangs are an old problem. Lots of governments have tried to take some significant action to clip their wings, and the United States, for example, in the 80s really cracked down on crime. And while it did have an effect, we still have gangs. They're not going away.
What was the country in Latin America that just threw everyone in prison?
El Salvador.
Yeah.
President Bukele, the coolest dictator. We know because he says so himself. Yeah, Ecuador might do that. That could be a pattern. I mean, it's been pretty effective. And there's more countries in Latin America that have crime problems, so that could become a recurring theme. We'll see.
Right to jail right away. No trial, no nothing.
Well, they do have a trial. It's just the bar for proving someone guilty is very, very low. Like in El Salvador, they did process everybody who was accused of being a gang member, but proving they were a gang member meant that they had gang tattoos, and that was sufficient.
Yeah, I was quoting a TV show. I think it was from Community. It's a really good GIF. Chat, if you know what I'm talking about, press 4. I would guess a lot of people have seen that one. It's pretty funny.
Let's see. Oh, there was a terrorist attack in New Orleans. Did you see that?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, that was like a New Year's Eve, I think, when that happened. That was, I think that was another ramming terror attack. That was some guy in a truck turned into downtown New Orleans in an area that was supposed to be blocked off. And then he just rammed a bunch of people. I think he shot some too, before the police got to him anyway. Yeah, that guy was Islamic State affiliated. That was apparently his motive. Nothing else really came of it, though. I mean, at this point, you basically just expect some. It had been a while since the last one, so we were probably due. I was kind of curious what the death toll was, because New Orleans is a notoriously violent city.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, relatively more people died because of that attack than would die normally during a weekend in New Orleans. So it was fairly destructive, even by the standards of New Orleans, low as they may be. I actually looked up homicide statistics for American cities because I was curious where New Orleans was. And I couldn't find it on the list until I realized that it was number 1.
Damn.
I just didn't even look at number 1 because I didn't think it would be first place. I was thinking like Detroit or Dallas, but no, New Orleans was top of the list.
Damn. Most violent city in the country, you said?
Most violent homicides per annum. I wasn't able to find shootings, though. Yeah, as far as violent homicides, I think it was only about 300 to 400, something in that range.
Mm-hmm.
But I would guess that the number of shootings and injuries from shootings is probably considerably higher.
I think we did get a question in Discord that Fuzzy Cord passed along as well.
Update on the presidential kerfuffle in South Korea. I don't think I've read anything. I think the warrant on the president expired. It was very close to expiring. He was almost arrested a couple weeks ago, but then his security detail and a bunch of presidential supporters blocked the police from arresting him in his residence. So there was some question of how the government would approach that, since he was basically just openly defying the law.
Mm-hmm.
I think they were discussing some kind of new plan for how to arrest him, but I don't think anything came of it, because I haven't read anything new in that regard. But other than that, I haven't seen or read anything new about it. So I think the investigation is ongoing. The investigation does not necessarily hinge on questioning him. So that seems to be in the works still. He could easily still be removed, but I'm sure they would prefer to question him, if only to establish the standard that if you are a president being impeached, that you can't just refuse to cooperate with the negotiation. That's a bad precedent to set. So I've got to think that they're going to try to get him in for questioning eventually, one way or the other. But for now, as far as I know, he's still holed up in his residence.
Is he fortifying his position, or just being stubborn and they're not using force?
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. He's still got his supporters protesting around the residence, trying to, act as a barrier, and he still has a security detail. I think there was like a question about whether or not Congress, the legislature anyway, in South Korea could maybe order his security detail to stop providing security. And they were, I think, talking or questioning the leader of said security detail at one point. But I don't think any decision was made. So he is definitely defying the law, but he is also somewhat entrenching his position in so much as he's ensuring that wall of people are constantly around his residence. And not a whole lot going on, just sort of stuff on trend for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could talk a little bit about some trade war stuff that's been going on.
Sure. There was a quick question, which we've gotten before, but they just wanted to know what sources you recommend for information outside of main media, something that's more in depth on foreign policy that isn't surface level.
More in depth, okay. So actually, let me throw out the usual disclaimer. This would be a good time for it. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. Participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So that said, pretty much any source that is more detailed is generally going to have some kind of bias. Generally more of a clear-cut bias, ideally, if it's a quality publication, but a bias nonetheless. So it's kind of hard to offer more quality sources without, giving people ideas. If he's reading that, then he must be like a fascist, a communist, whatever. But the reality is that if you want better coverage, you're going to have to kind of tap into outlets like that. So think tanks of one kind or another. For example, this isn't an example of a think tank, but it's an example of bias. A good publication that covers news in Latin America is America's Quarterly. But the issue about America's Quarterly is that it's mostly funded by American corporations. So the news coverage tends to focus more on issues that are relevant to American corporations. And it tends to be skeptical of developments in Latin America that are inimical to the interests of American corporations. So while it does have an editorial stance, it actually does do pretty in-depth coverage of political developments in Latin America and has a pretty broad range of coverage across Latin America rather than in just a couple of key countries. So on the one hand, quality broad coverage, but on the other hand, it's from a very particular perspective. So does that make it a good source or a bad source? That's going to depend on your personal perspective. Even if you don't always agree with the stuff in a publication, just the fact that they're talking about major developments that a lot of mainstream outlets don't cover means it can still be worth reading them. So America's Quarterly, I would qualify as a very good source. If you're more of a left-wing bent, you're probably going to take issue with some of the editorial stance, but if you still read it, you're probably going to learn a lot more about stuff happening on the ground in Latin American politics and economics than you would if you were just watching something like CNN or whatever. And there's a relatively limited range of good publications. So, often the publications, often it's basically impossible to find a good publication that does not have like an explicit bias. It's pretty rare that they don't. So, you're going to have to kind of make peace with that if you do want to improve the quality of your media diet, so to speak. And try to be, maintain healthy skepticism regardless of the editorial bias, regardless of whether or not it agrees with your pre-existing beliefs. But if you're willing to do that and you're able to do that, yeah, there's definitely a lot of stuff out there. America's Quarterly is one. Christian Science Monitor is actually a really good outlet. Despite the name, it is actually very good at being neutral. That's probably my top ranked outlet. I don't read them too much because I notice that a lot of the stuff they cite is stuff that I just already read anyway. But if there is a complex issue, they very frequently have the best coverage of it because they do a really good job of trying to cover all the angles, all the different perspectives and whatnot. Think tanks, Center for Strategic International Studies, Council of Foreign Relations. A lot of people are skeptical of those because they're seen as establishment institutions, which they are. But again, they're going to talk in more detail about given regions of the world and given issues than you will see elsewhere. In fact, if you look at news articles in, say, CNN or the BBC or whatever, a good chunk of their more detailed analysis is basically just quoting people who work at think tanks like that. So, one of the ways you can save some time and get better information is to just cut out the middleman and go right to the kinds of sources that journalists themselves often just rely on and quote when they're writing up articles about news events and whatnot. So those are two, CSIS, CFR. Something like Brookings Institution or the Cato Institute, those can be good. Those have generally more explicit political biases, but their analysis is generally pretty good. So if you want like a good representation of an argument in favor of or against a given policy, or critiquing, some international news event, those are pretty good sources. There's a whole bunch of newsletters for like niche outlets. I was looking at Al Monitor and Amwaj recently. I have two of their newsletters in my newsletter email inbox that I'm subscribed to. What else? Russia Matters is a good newsletter that covers Russia in like extreme painful detail. I don't even read all of their newsletters. Like if I do sit down to read one, I'll read like a chunk of it for given subjects that I'm the most interested in. But there's just so much information in even just one of those newsletters that's kind of overwhelming. If you're gonna like cover the whole world, you do have to ration your time a little bit. God, what else is good? Financial Times does good like economic and business news. That's pretty good for that. I'd really have to sit down and just look through all the newsletters I have had. U.S. politics, Politico actually has a whole litany of good newsletters that just cover basic stuff going on. Well, not even basic stuff. They do pretty good detailed coverage. They'll actually, they do a good job of maintaining contacts in Washington and trying to break down the actual negotiations behind the scenes going on regarding new legislation and whatnot. That stuff I was talking about earlier with regard to the rule changes in the House and whatnot, that was all stuff that I'd read in a Politico newsletter. Individual think tanks often have their own podcasts. Those can also be worth listening to or reading if they have transcripts. What was the one? Trade Guys was one such podcast. Trade Talks was another one. One of them has been discontinued, but I don't remember exactly which one it was. Peterson Institute hosted one of them, and that's the one that I think is ongoing. CSIS has a whole bunch of good regional podcasts, too. Those can be good. Southeast Asia Chessboard is one of them, for example. I don't listen to them regularly. Generally, I kind of tap in when I see something happening that's relevant to them. China stuff. I have a subscription to a newsletter from Sin, but I can't read most of it because they paywall all of their stuff. When I'm a millionaire, Neuro, I'm going to get a subscription to Sin.
It's that expensive?
Well, it's not that expensive. I think it's like $250 a year for an annual subscription. It's a lot for me.
That's kind of high. It sounds high to me anyway.
I mean, that's if you want like premium news coverage, that's about what you're going to be paying. You know, generally I only pay for premium news coverage if there's like a discount. Like Foreign Policy Mag, which is another good source. Actually, like general foreign policy, foreignpolicy.com and Foreign Affairs are really good sources. I recently got a subscription to Foreign Policy for the first time in a very, very long time. But the only reason I could afford it is because they had a big discount. So it was only like $120 a year. Only, quote unquote. That's still fairly expensive. Wall Street Journal I have a subscription to, but only because they had like a special offer. It was like a $1 a month for the first year.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, that's in my price range, but it's going to go up to like $300 a year after that. So I turned off the auto renew for that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did note that Sin, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation on that. Sin is a business news outlet in China. It's like the business news website for all things like China economy. They very frequently get quoted in all kinds of media whenever anybody's doing a story about the Chinese economy. Their coverage is very good. It's just expensive, but they actually do have a deal where it's like $200 a year, and you also get, in addition to that, a free annual subscription to the Wall Street Journal. So when my WSJ subscription is up, I'm very seriously considering doing that, because $250 a year is still like very expensive, but if I'm getting both Sin and Wall Street Journal, that's not bad. That's like $60 a year for both individually. So I might end up doing. I'm still thinking about that though. It's expensive, and I need to save up money for my computer too, because it's coming to the end of its useful life. I've managed to stretch it out considerably, but I found out recently that Windows, 11, is not going to work on my hardware. Like the hardware is so old that it's just not going to be supported, which is unfortunate because I was kind of hoping I could squeeze out a couple more years with Windows 11, but not going to happen. And since Windows 10 is not going to be supported anymore, I'm going to have to make some kind of change there.
That's so crazy and awesome that it's been able to last through playing BG3, though. I was bragging to a friend about that, of like, Kukio is so heckin' smart, he would just be smiling ear to ear to hear that his thing that he built for you is able to run a game of that caliber. It's insane.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he did good work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are the main recommendations I would have off the top of my head. I think I have different recommendations every time somebody asks me that, because I can't remember all of them. The Economist, they do good work. Obviously, they have like a very pro-business, pro-liberal, classically liberal editorial stance. So, not everybody likes that, but they generally do pretty good coverage. Let's see, what's a good China podcast? Pekingology is a good one. China Power is a good one. I feel like there was another one. There used to be a really good China news website, but they went out of business because they couldn't make enough money. Very regrettable. Yeah, anyway. That would be my answer. I think I've answered it in YouTube comments before. If somebody can fish that up, maybe they could find some additional recommendations. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there as far as news coverage, but it's just kind of hard to find because it's a little bit niche.
Yeah, the comment, every news source has a bias, is one that I feel like is a major lesson that I would like listeners of this segment to keep in front of them on a regular basis. Confirmation bias is so sexy, and it's a really big turn on to be told that you're so smart, you're on the right side of history, the other side is just really dumb and evil, and it's a good thing that you're watching our show because it feels nice to be told that you're right. It doesn't feel as good to like have opposition or criticism levied at you.
Regrettably so. Yeah, having a diverse media diet is important, including stuff that challenges, your pre-existing beliefs. But I think it's important too to try to find analytical sources that take a more analytical approach to, talking about the news and events. Sensationalism isn't helping anybody. That's low quality coverage, almost regardless of context or circumstances.
Performative outrage.
Yeah.
Someone earlier was asking if you listened to Musk's interview with the AFD lady.
No, I haven't. I did hear about that, though.
What is AFD?
Alternative for Deutschland. That's the populist German policy we were talking about earlier. And he I think he interviewed one of their leaders, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I didn't follow up on it, though. I was pretty dubious that... I'm pretty dubious about Elon Musk's interview skills. He doesn't strike me as like a natural interviewer. And given how politically active he's been for the past few years, I just kind of assumed it was some kind of partisan exercise. Yeah, if I'm going to watch an interview, it's probably going to be the Lex Friedman Zelensky interview that happened recently. That actually did catch my eye. So I'm thinking about sitting down and listening to that. I'm a little tired of listening to podcasts, though, because there can be really good stuff in a podcast, but the format just kind of drags out the length. And I've gotten impatient as I've gotten older. I would just prefer all of the key information summarized quickly so that I can move on to the next thing. I don't want to sit through like 10 minutes of pleasantries and then 10 minutes of unrelated stuff at the end and then 10 minutes of tangents that don't really relate to the key topic. Like, if you really want to, you could probably take like a half-hour podcast and sum it down to maybe 5 minutes of substantive information. Some podcasts are better about that than others. Some of them actually give you like full value for your time. You get 30 minutes of good information for 30 minutes of listening, but a lot of them don't. And so I've kind of gotten out of the habit of listening to them, but there are good ones out there. It can be worth it. And if the interviewer and the interviewee are particularly interesting, it can still be worth it. So I don't necessarily think Lex Friedman is a great interviewer, but I have heard him say that he's kind of working on it. He wants to practice it. So I can respect that. And Zelensky obviously is a very interesting interviewee. So I'm kind of curious about the things that they've said. I did watch a YouTube video about the interview, so I'm roughly familiar with what they talked about, but I'm more interested to see specifically the dialogue, the details and whatnot. I think that could be very interesting. So we'll see if I actually do that.
Someone in chat said that their Ukrainian buddies were fuming at that Zelensky interview, and they did not have kind words for Lex Friedman.
Yeah, that's what I heard. What I heard is that he came across as very naive. Yeah, I think one of the things was Lex Friedman said that, Vladimir Putin is a patriot and that he should be treated with respect so that they can negotiate a peace to the war.
Oh my God. Ouch.
Yeah, that's questionable.
Goodness gracious.
I think Vladimir Putin could be described as a nationalist. I don't think that's in dispute, but calling him a patriot, debatable. Lots of people in Russia would debate that, especially the reformists in Russia. Lots of them do not like him. Whatever else can be said about him as a nationalist, he is in the end a corrupt politician who is basically a parasite on the Russian economy. The whole Russian political economy that he oversees is very sort of extractive and parasitic in nature. And its maintenance is not good for Russia by any stretch of the imagination. So regardless of what you think about Ukraine and NATO and whatnot, like, Putin is not good for Russia. I don't think that should be controversial. I know he's credited with pulling the country out of the 90s, but a lot of that is very overwrought.
Yeah, time marches forward. They were going to get out of the 90s regardless.
Well, yeah, in a literal sense, but also in an economic sense. High commodity prices is what really saved Russia, not so much Vladimir Putin. But yeah, lots of people heard that statement and were not happy about it. That is
Yeah.
to say, Lex Friedman talking about Vladimir Putin. They thought that statement especially was very naive.
Mm-hmm.
So of course that got a good response from Zelensky. He was very incredulous upon hearing that.
It's interesting that whoever's in the top leadership spot for a country gets a lot of credit for the economic shifts that happened during their time, even if their role doesn't really have much to do with that at all. And the forces at play that cause either a swing up or a swing down economically are like off the back of the past several decades. So to be like, oh wow, this president really drove the gas prices down. It's like, that's such a broad-based issue and situation that to say that it was one person's credit or fault is usually way overblown.
Yeah, that whole dynamic really defined the aughts globally, because those years were peak China shock. China joined the WTO in 1999, and then there was a huge global economic boom on the back of explosive Chinese economic growth that came after. That lasted for about 10 years or so, probably up until 2008 with the financial crisis. And so many governments around the world saw such an influx of cash from high commodity prices that resulted from that global economic boom that it made a number of political careers. Vladimir Putin was one in Russia. In Brazil, they had Lula da Silva. He was famous for a lot of profligate anti-poverty programs that were implemented in his time. And you can credit him with using the money to do that, but the fact is he could only do it because of high commodity prices. And if not for that, he would probably not be remembered as well as he is. He would probably not even be president right now. I don't remember. I think it was Jacob Zuma in South Africa also benefited from that. That was one of the reasons he was able to stay in power so long, despite being, a corrupt shithead, basically. Manmohan Singh in India, to a lesser degree, he's remembered fondly because he kind of oversaw a period of decent economic growth. But India didn't benefit as much from high commodity prices because India is not itself much of a commodity exporter. But it was a good period for India nonetheless, and so Singh kind of benefited from that. Who else? Basically, anybody who exported a lot of commodities would have done well, but those are some of the key figures, the key leading politicians and large commodity exporters that really benefited. Obviously, all of the oil exporters at that time were doing pretty well too, but they didn't have a lot of populist politicians running for office at the time. Being autocratic, absolute monarchies, they don't really have populists so much. At least ones that are not violent anyway. I guess you could consider Islamism or jihadism an expression of populism, to a degree. I have heard that argumentation before, but that's not quite what we're talking about here. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. What was the original question?
I think we started with the interview. It wasn't really a question. Right, they just commented and said that Ukrainians were pissed about it.
Commodity boom, right. Let's see, if that's all we had for questions, then I can kind of dig into some of the trade war stuff.
Sure.
It's not necessarily super in-depth. Basically, the US government over the past couple weeks has really been dialing into sanctioning ships, cargo ships, specifically oil tankers. The US had been trying to pressure the Russian oil industry after Russia invaded Ukraine, but they didn't want to go too hard because they were afraid that it would have a negative impact on the global economy. Russia obviously is a major oil exporter, and if you just cut all of their oil exports down to zero, in a very short amount of time, that's going to be very disruptive. And especially in an election year, 2024, the Biden administration was especially reluctant to kind of crack down on that. So now that the election's over, they've kind of pulled out the stops in recent weeks. Also, it helps that just overall oil supplies in the oil market is kind of more stable now. Things were a little finicky after the invasion, but now there's more confidence in the market, and so there's a sense that Washington can go a little harder at this point. So they've released a list of several hundred oil tankers that are now sanctioned, like specific ships that nobody around the world can do business with without basically themselves being targeted by the U.S. government. And this is significantly more than had been sanctioned before. They had been sanctioning individual ships before, but they'd been doing it at a pretty slow pace. So that the fleet that was available to Russia's oil exporters was large enough that they could still make pretty significant amounts of money. That may not be true going forward. The amount of ships targeted now is a significant chunk of the fleet that had been carrying Russian oil. And they're going to have to find some way around this restriction now that's been placed on these ships if they want to continue exporting. Now, from what I read, this could have a significant impact on overall Russian exports, Russian oil exports, that is. But at the same time, I'm also very dubious. Because on the one hand, yes, this is a significant step. It's a significant escalation in sanctions. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with a tangible commodity like this, especially one like oil, it's fluid, it's not too hard to smuggle it. Like one of the ways that Venezuelan oil exporters have been smuggling oil out of the country is that they'll take ships which are sanctioned, they'll load them up with oil, and then they'll meet up with a ship that's not sanctioned on the high seas, and they'll actually transfer the oil there, just out in the ocean. And that's been pretty effective in the past. I don't know if Russia will be able to scale that approach up enough to continue exporting oil significantly, but presumably they're going to do stuff like that. So I think that while this will be very disruptive and presumably will increase costs faced by Russia's oil exporters, in the sense that it's going to kind of engorge the share of profits that middlemen, specifically smugglers, are going to get out of sales, they will probably still be able to get the oil out, I would guess. Some of it depends, too, on the degree to which refineries in places like China and India are going to be willing to continue taking oil from, Russia in general, but also specifically from these ships. I did read that there was a major refinery center in China, a major port in China that has lots of refineries, that did announce that they were going to basically completely ban all ships that had been sanctioned by the U.S. government from docking at the port. So that would seem to suggest that there's going to be a significant disruption to trade between Russia and China as far as oil. But in fact, that hasn't been the case. Basically, the number of ships that the U.S. had been sanctioning was sufficiently small that their operations are not expected. Well, I shouldn't say the number of ships sanctioned is small. I should say that the portion of total traffic at this Chinese port that is represented by ships sanctioned by the United States had been relatively small. So losing them is not going to be a big problem for them. And again, presumably with smuggling techniques of various kinds, even if the U.S. did significantly try to curb or completely block ports like the one I'm talking about in China from importing Russian oil, they would probably still be able to get a significant amount through, albeit at greater cost. This same approach to sanctioning individual ships, they've escalated not only in terms of targeting ships involved in the trade of Russian oil, they've also significantly increased the number of ships that they're sanctioning that have been trafficking Iranian oil. Presumably that's partly retaliation for Iranian escalation in the Levant, which of course sees ongoing conflict. So that's about it. Like I said, it's not super in-depth. This isn't going to break the bank for Russia or Iran. But again, this is going to increase costs. And given the scale of the escalation, it could increase costs significantly and cut into profits correspondingly pretty significantly. So money will continue to be made, but relatively less, potentially significantly less than before. I think I also had a note that the United States is also going to sanction 2 major natural gas producers in Russia, which they'd already been doing, but the new thing now is that they're going to do it in conjunction with the British government, which had not been sanctioning them before. So between combined effort by the UK and the US, and also just general escalation in the sanctions that had already been targeting these natural gas producers, it could become significantly more difficult for Russian natural gas producers, specifically these 2, to get financing for continued production and also for export. Now, again, Russia and Russian producers have proven to be able to circumvent these kinds of restrictions, but again, the restrictions are not meant to completely block them. They're meant to make it relatively more difficult and expensive to conduct operations, which in turn reduces the overall amount of money that these operations can return to the Russian government. So in that sense, relatively successful. Whether or not it'll be successful enough to significantly change the Russian government's calculus in Ukraine, for example, that remains to be seen. I would guess probably not, but we'll see. This is going to be a crunch year financially for Russia. I think we talked about that last time. Their sovereign wealth fund is running out of liquid assets, and that's been a big crutch for them as far as covering deficits. You know, they do make enough money to cover most of their core operating costs in the Russian government, but the amount of increases that the Russian budget has been facing over time has meant that they have been running a deficit since the war started. And covering that deficit has actually been pretty difficult overall, because they have not been able to borrow money from financial markets like a country normally would when it was trying to fund a deficit. So the sovereign wealth fund has been that crutch that has kind of helped hold that deficit. That's probably going to run out for the most part this year. And so that deficit will probably not be met. And that's going to mean some degree of cuts by the Russian government. Presumably, they'll prioritize war spending, which means that they'll probably be cutting social spending of one kind or another, I would guess. And that could put pressure on the Russian government politically to try to wrap up the war in some way, or at least agree to some kind of ceasefire that would mitigate their cost expenditures in the war. You know, one way or the other, they're going to be facing more pressure in 2025 financially than they have at any year since the war started. See, how much time do we have?
We're chilling. We can go as long as we want to. We're at an hour 47 minutes. It has been a relatively slow week, so I am down to Baldur's Gate after.
Okay. Well, I don't really have anything else here. I think that was all of the highlights. Yeah. So unless we have some questions, you know, we might switch over.
Sure. I'm in a match, so I don't know if there's
okay.
any silly country we haven't talked about in a bit.
Silly country?
How's Djibouti?
So. How's Djibouti? Djibouti's doing fine. I haven't heard any drama out of Djibouti recently. So as far as I know, they still have the same president in power who's been in control for like 30 years or so. Still lots of international bases, you know, hosting the anti-piracy forces in the region.
Mm-hmm.
Hasn't been any big terrorist attacks, no big political upheaval. The economy is doing okay. Yeah, it's just quiet. Status quo ante, pretty much.
Good to know.
Yeah, I don't think there's anybody else we haven't talked about.
I've been reading a book on Viking history, and I didn't know this, but Dublin was founded by Viking raiders back in the day, A lot of the major Irish cities were founded by raiders or settlers of some kind. At the time when they arrived, there were a bunch of different competing Irish kings who all kind of had a small fiefdom, and because they were fighting with each other, it was relatively easier for them to kind of grab land and hit them when they're distracted with each other.
Gotcha. Yeah, I always knew there were lots of Celts there, but I hadn't known that the Vikings had founded specific settlements like Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought they'd be more indigenous. But the Vikings did get around, so
yeah,
maybe not too surprising.
Population boom plus major breakthrough in seafaring technology for the choppy North Seas. How's Niger after the coup? Someone's asking.
I haven't heard anything out of Niger. I did hear that Chad recently had a potential coup attempt. It was characteristic for the 2020s, a badly organized coup, so nothing came of it. Mm-hmm. It's just some guys with guns that basically met up outside the presidential palace in the capital. I guess they thought that they were going to storm it, but they were not able to. I think it all ended up basically just getting arrested or killed in the subsequent gunfight. But yeah, Niger I haven't heard as much about. As far as I know, they're all still trying to distance themselves from France. I think, what was it I read? I think I read recently that Senegal is going to eject French forces from their territory. Now, Senegal has much better relations with France than, say, Niger or Burkina Faso or Mali. So it is notable that even they now seem to be trying to get French forces out of the region. Been kind of an upsurge in nationalism in the Sahel over the past 10 years. Yeah, French military forces do end up withdrawing from Senegal, then I think pretty much their only significant military presences on the continent at that point will be in Djibouti, maybe Madagascar, and one other one. The other one is escaping me. I think it's somewhere in West Africa, I want to say. But I can't quite remember where. But yeah, other than that, I haven't heard any new developments in the Sahel. It's still violent. Wagner Group / Africa Corps, whatever you want to call it, still active there. Still deeply involved in gold laundering, which I still think is hilarious. It's some James Bond villain nonsense. ECOWAS is still trying to figure out what to do about all of these states leaving it. Because pretty much everybody that's had a military coup in the past 10 years has announced that they want to leave ECOWAS. And so that's a good chunk of West Africa there, even if it's only like 3 or 4 states. They're geographically very large. And so it's kind of brought into question how relevant ECOWAS is going to be in the future to West Africa. I've got to think they'll end up rejoining at some point. Because I don't think any of the states that have left ECOWAS are really viable on their own. They did announce a kind of alliance. We talked about that before. Do you remember ASS?
Oh yeah, it's an acronym for something.
Yeah.
How could I forget ASS?
Yeah, the Alliance of Sahelian States. That's the alliance that all of the new military juntas in West Africa have announced as sort of their new anti-ECOWAS organization. I'm not even really sure what it's supposed to do. I guess the idea is that they're concerned that ECOWAS or Nigeria may try to forcibly reinstate their membership and possibly, change their government. So they've announced a military alliance called the Alliance of Sahelian States, which has a much less hilarious acronym in French than it does in English, to try to defend themselves against the regional hegemon. But given how little history of cooperation there is between the, I think, 4 states involved, and just given the significance of the insurgencies in their respective territories, I don't think they would be able to significantly resist any kind of major military incursion into their territory. Last I checked, Burkina Faso didn't even control 40% of its territory because that territory was held by rebels. So I don't really know what the Burkina Faso military is going to be able to do to, say, the Nigerian military if it invades, given that it can't even handle rebels enough to control most of its territory. But they have announced the alliance, so that is technically a thing, for whatever little that's worth. But again, these states are not... Their cooperation seems to be mostly military. They don't seem to be doing, like, trade deals, economic cooperation. And that's important because there's pretty much no individual state in West Africa, except maybe Nigeria and Ghana, that can be isolationist and still have an economy that is decent. Most of the countries in West Africa have economies that have historically been interrelated and intermixed. There's a lot of plantations in the coastal region of West Africa that depend on migrant labor that crosses borders from country to country. And that's been the norm for a very long time. Keep in mind, pretty much all of West Africa was united under French rule as French West Africa for a very long time, for more than a century. And correspondingly, the economies of the region just kind of naturally gelled together. There's a lot of cross-border trade that became normal. And that was maintained even after independence. And ECOWAS as an institution is kind of designed to try to preserve and expand on that kind of free trade across borders. Individual countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, they're basically just too small and too dependent on exports to really be viable entities unto themselves. And so withdrawing from ECOWAS and the free trade provisions that were included in it seems very self-defeating to me. For a small country to try to distance itself like that seems like a very bad idea. And I don't think that they've been doing better since they left, so that would seem to support my proposition here, that they're probably going to end up coming back to ECOWAS at some point, once their economies have kind of struggled enough. It could be that there's enough political support for the juntas for them to kind of ignore the economic pain of that decision, but I've got to think that that's going to wane with time. Because I don't think they're going to do better economically under a junta by self-interested generals than they're going to do with some kind of more conciliatory government that is willing to engage with their neighbors more. I would also note that there really has not been substantive progress in dealing with the insurgencies in these different countries that originally led and contributed to the conditions that resulted in the military juntas seizing power in the first place. Pretty much all of the generals that have seized power in West Africa over the past few years have tried to justify their seizure of power in terms of the ability of the previous governments to deal with ongoing insurgencies. They said that once they were firmly in power, they would be able to deal with them relatively quickly and successfully. That has not happened, even with the support of Africa Corps, which again is a very weird name for a Russian mercenary group in Africa. But what would be a good name for a Russian mercenary group in Africa? I guess no such thing. But regardless, they have not successfully dealt with the insurgents. And so that source of legitimacy, I would think, is going to wane considerably in the subsequent coming years. Are you familiar with Ghana?
Not super familiar.
So Ghana is one of the most, maybe the most successful country in West Africa, economically and politically. Relatively stable politics. They've had multiple peaceful transfers of power between different parties and leaders over the past 30 years, I want to say. Not so much since independence, but for the past 30 years, they've had a good track record. They've also got a relatively diverse economy for West Africa. Still lots of commodities, gold in particular. One of the reasons Ghana has been more successful than its neighbors is because it exported lots and lots of gold, and that gave the government a very strong source of revenue that it was able to invest in institutions like education, public services of one kind or another, etc. So having gold, definitely a big advantage, but they also export a decent amount of chocolate, And the government has been relatively successful in investing in human capital in Ghana, to the point where they actually do have a decently sized services sector, again, by the standards of West Africa. So the overall level of economic development, GDP per capita, income, the diversity of the economy, all of those are actually pretty strong for the region. They've done very well for themselves. They even have a space program.
Good job,
It actually used to be called the Gold Coast. All of the different European colonies in West Africa had names like that: Grain Coast, Ivory Coast, etc. So Ghana was called the Gold Coast. When they became independent, they changed the name. Ghana was like a historical empire that had been in West Africa centuries ago. Although I don't think its territory actually overlapped with present-day Ghana, funnily enough.
I did not know this.
Yeah, West Africa kind of gets ignored a lot. Even in the United States, where we, in schools, we obviously teach the history of triangular trade between Europe, West Africa, and the Americas. West Africa is where we got most of the slaves that we ended up importing over here to the Americas. But we really do not teach much about West Africa in that period, like the politics, the economics. It's basically just one leg of the triangular trade. And then we kind of move on to other topics. Which is too bad, because it's actually got pretty interesting history. A lot of the slave trading African states that emerged in West Africa over the course of the early modern period, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, those states were actually pretty powerful and were able to maintain their independence well into the 19th century. Even as European empires were growing rapidly over the course of the 1800s, they didn't really want to mess with the slave trading states too much. And it wasn't really until after Britain banned slavery that their economies really declined significantly, which is not surprising, right? Their main export had been slaves. So once you can't export that anymore, that's going to create problems for you economically. And it was only the economic decline that followed the ban of slavery that resulted in those states eventually succumbing to European domination. There was a whole gaggle of them. Actually, there was one that was owned by, what was it? Poland, I want to say? No, not Poland. Maybe it was Denmark. There was some weird colonial power in West Africa. Because normally when you think of European powers and European empires, you think British, or you think of the French, maybe the Portuguese. Those are the main ones historically overseas, especially in Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. But every so often you'd see like a weird cameo by for example, in Southern Africa, Austria had a colony for a while. And that colony eventually became what is now the capital city of Mozambique. So there was a similar development in West Africa, where they had a colony founded by one of the smaller European nations. Might have been a couple. A lot of the colonies in West Africa changed hands multiple times over the course of their founding, let's say, to the period that ended European empire in the early mid-20th century. I want to say Fort Christensen was one. I think that was Ghana. You've got me curious. That's the current capital of Ghana. That's currently, and it was what? Fort something. Oh, it was a Dutch fort. Okay, so Ghana was originally a Dutch colony then. All right, so that's not the one I was thinking of. Oh, wait. Formed from the merger of distinct settlements around British Fort James, Dutch Fort, I can't even pronounce that, Crevecoeur, and Danish Fort Christianberg. Okay, that's what I was thinking of. I didn't know that it was actually multiple forts, though. I thought it was just one. So yeah, it was partly originally a Danish colony then. Yeah, Denmark didn't have a whole lot of colonies overseas over the course of European empires, but they did have a couple outposts in West Africa, and this was one of them, and it eventually turned into a major city. Obviously, Denmark also has, in terms of overseas colonies, Greenland, which has been in the news recently. They actually also originally had what are now the U.S. Virgin Islands. I don't know how many people overseas are familiar with U.S. Caribbean holdings. I don't know how many people in the United States are familiar with U.S. Caribbean territories, but among them are a set of islands called the Virgin Islands. And currently they're known as the U.S. Virgin Islands because the U.K. also has some Virgin Islands that are actually still part of the U.K. They're in one of their overseas territories. But in the U.S. case, we actually got our islands from Denmark in, I think, around 1910. And it was actually a cash transaction. It was a very old school trade-off. The Danish government was looking to cut their budget. You know, they were having to spend a lot of money, you know, defending the islands and paying for the population. So they actually agreed to sell the islands to the United States government for, I think, a couple $1 million or something. I don't remember the exact amount. I think it was one of the last big territorial acquisitions for the United States that was done by cash. Are you winning?
We slowly lost. It was a 36-minute match. We ended up running out of resources on our side of the map. A war of attrition.
The roughest kind.
But that's okay. Nice entertainment for the chat. Well, cool. We can take a mini break here. I need to get something to eat, but then we can do some BG3. Thank you, Fuzzy Cold, for handling questions, and thank you, Agent Smith, for your expertise. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.